So, this is the interpretation of accounts question from 2019, Shannon PLC. So we've already seen this question. We've already done our part A, which is worth 50 marks. And as you can see in practically every question 5, part B is always worth 40 marks. And it always asks you to basically evaluate how the company is doing, using relevant ratios and other information. So obviously these are relevant ratios, as are the other ratios that you would be able to get from the figures given in the question. And you're using those ratios basically to state whether you think that company is doing well or not. This question comes up every year. There is a set thing we can do to learn off a good portion of this answer, but because it comes up every year, the marks would be too easy if you could learn the same thing every time and write the same thing. So what they do is they change around how they're asking the question, and depending on how they ask the question will depend on what they're looking for. Long story short, the viewpoint of the question can change every year. So basically I'm just showing you the 2019 question, and all you need to know here is for this one they are telling us to indicate if the ordinary shareholders would be satisfied with the performance of the company. So whether the ordinary shareholders would be satisfied. The next year here, which was 2018, again same thing, 40 marks going for it. Indicate whether the debenture holders would be satisfied with the performance and state of affairs. So the first one was ordinary shareholders. These are the people who own shares in the company. They're the stakeholders. And if you own a part of the company, there are certain things that you care more about than others. You probably care more about whether you can get a higher dividend, or whether the worth of the company is increasing. Whereas when you are looking at it from the perspective of a debenture holder, you are somebody who gives the company a loan, a form of a loan. So you're now looking at it from the perspective of, are they making enough profit to pay back the loan? And are they a secure enough company to pay back the loan? That's 2018. 2017 is looking at it from the perspective of a bank manager. So a bank manager, you're giving him advice about whether a loan of 300,000 at a rate should be granted to this company. Again, you're doing the same thing. You're analyzing whether this company is profitable and whether this company is good or not, to basically whether they're doing well or not. But you're looking at it from a different perspective. You're not looking at it from the perspective of having shares. You're not looking at it from the perspective of giving them out a debenture in previous years, basically the same thing, giving them out a loan in previous years. Now you're looking at whether seeing this company will be able to pay back a loan in the future. But again, in doing this, you are still assessing the company in a very similar way that you would have done for the debenture holder, and a very similar way which you would have done for the ordinary shareholder. The final one I'm going to show you here is from the 2016. So we've done 2019, 18, 17, and 16. And 2016, again, every year they more or less ask this in a different way. This time it's worth 35 marks, more or less the same. Would you as a shareholder be prepared to purchase more shares? So again, it's looking at it from a shareholder perspective, but we're not asking you, are you happy with how they're doing? We're looking at seeing, would you be willing to invest more? As in looking at the amount that that the company would potentially make in the future. Again, it's quite similar, but it's just a different way of asking, and your answer will have to differ depending on whichever way they ask. Because they change the way they ask it almost every single year, this part B can get confusing for people. People will assume that they can learn off the same 2 pages and basically reproduce that on the day of an exam. But if you do not tailor this towards the specifics of what you're asking, you can only ever hope for half marks. So in general, it's worth 40. And if I learn off 2 pages and I write those 2 pages as my answer, because I've learned it off and I think I can put that out every year, you will get a good few marks, but out of the 40, you're most likely to get 20 to 25. Probably 20. So you need to obviously learn off the set thing, that which I will be going through with you now in a second. And after that, we'll be looking more at tailoring it specifically to the different way they're asking the question. And there's 2 major ways they ask the question. The first one is if you own shares or if you want to buy shares in the future. And the second one is if you've given them a form of a loan. So, we've seen that in Part B they ask us a question and they vaguely ask us to basically talk about the performance of the company. And they ask you to write that from generally 4 different viewpoints. So on OneNote here, this is your OneNote, 5th year accounting. I have this written up here for the 4 different viewpoints in which they ask you to talk about. Well, obviously only one of these generally comes up. So the first one was to do with talking of it from an ordinary shareholder's perspective. This one is to do with an ordinary shareholder who is looking to buy shares, or maybe it could be somebody who presently has shares and they're looking to buy more shares. These 2 are quite similar. They're both looking at it from the perspective of somebody who has or is looking to buy shares. So generally you talk about the same things. The 3rd and 4th viewpoint, from a debenture holder's perspective, again, debenture is more or less a loan, and a bank manager's perspective. Both of these, though, are generally looking from the perspective of how the company is doing and whether they can pay back money that the company owes in the future, whether to a debenture holder or to a bank. So they're quite similar. First 2 here, as I said, they're both to do with shareholders. So just to kind of say that the question itself is going to ask you only about 2 or 3 vague lines just to discuss the performance of the company. And you're expected to write 2 pages. It's worth 40 marks. You'll have to write about 2 pages on it. And those 2 pages will need to be formed into certain sections. So the sections that you'll need to write about, I have written here, depending on the viewpoint. The first viewpoint here is to do ordinary shareholder. These are the 6. The second is to do with somebody who is looking to buy shares in the future, a shareholder currently, or a new shareholder looking at buying shares. Again, these are 6 here. If you look at these a little closely, you can see that the first 5 here are the exact same as the first 5 here, and the last one's a little different in both, but they're both to do with shares. This is control from your new shares you're purchasing and the amount you're purchasing, and this one is to do with the control and how much the share price you've purchased off is worth now. They're quite similar. 3rd and 4th viewpoint, again, the first 4 here are the same as above. Dividend is more or less the same as well as the first 2 above, so you actually have a lot of the information from the shareholders' point of view, which you could write about here as well. There's more on that I'll get to eventually. But there's a little bit here that you'll have to write about that's a little bit different depending on who's asking, really. This comes up every single year, but between the 4 different viewpoints, this has come up 3 times, this has come up 2 times, this has come up 2 times, and the last one here to the bank managers come up 3 times. So this is the last 10 years, so it's generally quite an even spread between the 4 different views. So again, the 2019 question, if we were to briefly look at it, we've done this already in terms of the start of the question, and this one, all they're saying to us is from an ordinary shareholder's perspective, would you be satisfied with the performance, state of affairs and prospects of the company? Use relevant ratios and other information to support your answer. You are given a little bit of information here. You're given the amounts basically in terms of the profit and loss and balance sheet for this year, and you're also given ratio information from last year, from 2017. So this is information coming from last year. when you are talking about how the company is doing, you're going to need to always reference it back to how they were doing last year, because then you can find out whether they're improving or not. 1 year, however, they did not show you information from last year. They showed you projected numbers from next year's accounts, and that was 2012. So when I show you the generic answers that I've kind of typed up, you have to bear in mind that they may not always tell you last year's information. Some year they may give you the projected figures for next year, and again you'll have to slightly twist the way you talk about it. So this is obviously making very little sense at the moment because I haven't gotten through anything solid. So this is the structure of how you'd write about half of your answer. This is looking at it from the perspective of any of the four, because all four of them all have liquidity, profitability, and gearing. And they're the three that I focused on. Liquidity, profitability, and gearing are the first three in all of these viewpoints. There are certain things in here that are in common as well. Sector and writing and dividends are in common, but they'll change. Your answer will change a bit more depending on who's talking, whose viewpoint you're looking at. Whereas the first three generally are a little easier to follow. So I've given a generic kind of structure, a skeleton answer that you can do to pretty much answer all of the questions you have from your exam papers from the last 10 years and get most of the marks. Not all, but most of the marks to do with these three, but only these three. As you can see, there's 8 things here, 7 or 8 things you have to write about for the venture holders. There is 7 or 8 things you have to write about for bank managers, and there's 6 here for the first 2. So we're only focusing on the first 3, but out of the 40 marks, generally this would be 15 to 20. So what's asked here? I'm looking at the first 3 things we have are profitability, liquidity, and gearing. They're the first 3 I'm looking at. So the profitability is how the company is doing in terms of are they making a profit or not. They're asking you all the time when they ask you this question, they'll ask you to use relevant ratios or information. And the most relevant information to use for the profitability discussion is the return on capital employed. This very first formula I've given you here at the start, return on capital employed, that is the formula you'll always use when you're talking about profitability in part B. That's the formula. If you were asked to do the formula here, return on capital employed, then you'll obviously have your answer. Return on capital employed equals 16%. If you weren't asked to do it here, you'll still have to use it now. You'll have to find out what it is now because you need to talk about it. So in 2019, you found this earlier in part A. In another year, you may not have found out what this number is, and you then have to kind of work this out for part B. Once you've worked out, let's say we get 10%. I now know the return on capital employed for this year is 10%. So this is just a skeleton answer. Obviously, I haven't filled it in specific to any year. This is so that you can use it for any question. Last year it was X%. Okay, how do I know what it was last year? Again, this is the 2019 question, and they told me here different information. The return on capital employed from last year was 5.8%. So it was 5.8% last year, and I'm giving you a hypothetical amount this year for it being 10% this year. So it was 10% this year. Last year was 5.8%. The rate has obviously increased compared to last year. The parts I have here in italics and smaller font, you don't use both of them. Obviously, you can't increase and decrease. So if it was 10% this year, 5.8% last year, it's obviously increased compared to last year. It's increased from 5.8% to 10%. As I said, this year and most years they give you the relevant information regarding last year, 2017. But sometimes they may give you the relevant information for next year, which they did in 2012. If they give you the relevant information for next year, this is what you'll write about. the ROCE for next year is predicted to be 12%. This would be an increase compared to this year because this year's was 10%. But the vast majority of time, this here will give you information for last year, and so when you're doing the answer, you do not need to discuss the predictions for next year because you don't have that information. So generally you'll write this part here. Return on capital employed for this year is whatever number you get, 10%, let's say. Last year was 5.8%. This rate has increased compared to last year. This is a healthy trend. If the return on capital employed goes up, it's a healthy trend. You want it to be as high as possible. It's basically getting the finding out how much money you'll make off of your investment in the company. So the higher it is, the better. So if it goes up, this is a healthy trend. If it goes down, it's an unhealthy trend. Obviously, in your answer, do not include both of these. That makes no sense. So again, ABC PLC, the name of the company, again, generic name I made up, is or is not a profitable company, as the return of 10% is or is not better than the return from risk-free investment of 1 to 2%, and is or is not better than the debenture rate of X%. What am I talking about here? You got to think about this from a real-world perspective. So the name of our company is ABC Limited, and we found out that our return on capital employed was 10%. So ABC PLC is a profitable company, as the return of 10% is better than the return from risk-free investment of 1 to 2%. Basically, there are certain things you can invest in, like prize bonds or like the credit union, where you will receive a very low return on your investment, 1 to 2%. If you go into credit union at the moment and you hand in your savings, you'll probably make about a 1% return, 1% interest on those savings every year. It's a very low risk giving your money into the credit union, but it obviously doesn't provide you much return. Investing in this company, ABC PLC, is probably more risky. However, at the moment they're getting a return of 10%. So they are a profitable company, and the return of 10% is better than the return of risk-free investment of 1 to 2%. Whether or not you understand this, you'll be writing the same thing every single time. If it's above 1 to 2%, then obviously they're a profitable company as the return is above the risk-free investment. And it is or is not better than the debenture rate of X%. So, debenture rate of X%. This risk-free investment rate, this is just a generic. If you were to Google this right now and ask Google what the risk-free investment rate is, it'll tell you whatever, 1.46 I think it is at the moment. It's generally between 1 and 2%. But this debenture rate is depending on the question. The debenture rate in this case for the question we have here, you can get, this company can get a loan, can get a debenture for 6% interest rate. So basically it's like buying money and having to pay back a 6% return. So looking at it from the perspective we make 10%, we're a profitable company, as our 10% is better than basically the loan rate of 6%. It's better than the debenture rate of X%. In this case it was 6. ABC Limited are or are not making efficient use of their resources this year. If they're profitable and they're above the two rates here, then they are making efficient use of their resources. If they're not profitable and they're below this rate, then they are not making efficient use of their resources. The next we have here is liquidity. So that's my profitability. That will get you, generally, if profitability is worth 6 or 7 marks, that will get you 5 or 6 out of the total marks. The last 1 or 2 marks will be dependent on answering the question specifically. I can't do that now because the question changes almost every year. But that will get you most of the marks. Again, around 6 marks you'll get for writing that. Your liquidity. And by the way, these are quite easy to follow once you've done enough of them. This is going to sound very confusing at the start. There's a lot of information here, but you are writing this and just filling in the percents and picking whether it's increased or decreased compared to last year, and talking about whether it's a good thing or whether it's not a good thing. you're repeating yourself quite a bit, and it's quite easy to get this 20 out of the 40 marks, to get half marks in this question. So the second sector we're looking at is from the second, I suppose, aspect of the company we're looking at is the liquidity. So for this one, we're using the quick asset test ratio. So the quick ratio or the asset test ratio we have here, it's in this section here, the liquidity section. We have two formulas. It's current assets minus closing stock is to current liabilities. So current assets minus closing stock is to current liabilities. I get my answer here to be 1.07 is to 1. I'm just making that up. 1.07 is to 1, let's say, is my answer when I work it out for this year. So my quick asset test ratio for this year is 1.07 is to 1. Last year it was, well, I need to find out. So for the 2019 question, my quick asset test ratio was 0.86 is to 1. So I'll go back here and I'll say that last year was 0.86 is to 1. The rate has improved compared to last year. Well, it has improved because now I'm at 1.07 is to 1. The quick ratio for next year is predicted to be whatever. So again, 2019 question, and most questions, 90% of them, they'll give you the information from last year. But on the one or two occasions that they've given you the information for next year, you wouldn't talk about last year's figures because you wouldn't have them. Instead, you talk about next year's figures. I've left this in here, but more often than not, this will not be needed. You will not need to discuss this because you won't have next year's predicted figures. You only have this year's figures and last year's figures. But if they ask you for next year's figures, this is here. What you'll write about next is basically, again, is this a healthy trend or is this an unhealthy trend? So you want this number again to be as high as possible. So this year is 1.07 is to 1. Last year was 0.86 is to 1. It's gone up. And we want this to be as high as possible. Again, like the last ratio. So if it's gone from 0.86 last year to 1.07 this year, it's gone up, it's improved. This is a healthy trend. If it's gone down from 0.86 last year to 0.6 this year, it's an unhealthy trend. So what's ideal? The ratio is above or below the ideal ratio of 1.1 is to 1. 1 is to 1 is the minimum. I should say actually minimum ideal ratio. That's the minimum amount basically you want your current assets minus closing stock to be compared to your current liabilities. If your current liabilities were very, very large and this was to be greater than this amount, then obviously this could be 0.5 is to 1, and that's a problem because now we're struggling to pay our short-term debts. But in this case, we've gone up to 1.07 is to 1. It's improved. It's a healthy trend. The ratio is above the minimum ideal ratio of 1 is to 1. ABC does not have a liquidity problem. I should actually say does not first and then say does. If we have gone up to 1.07, then obviously we're doing well. It's a healthy trend. We're above the minimum ratio, and we do not have a liquidity problem because we do not have a problem paying our short-term debts. So for every euro ABC owes in the short term, it has 1.07 available in liquid assets. For every euro we owe in our short term and our current liabilities here, we have 1.07 is to that euro. So for every euro we owe, we have whatever this is available in liquid assets. Again, this is the second one. I'm quite going through this a little fast. I'm not trying to match it up to any question, which is obviously going to make this a little bit confusing because it's harder to follow what I'm saying. But the reason I'm not matching this up to a question is because the question changes every year. This is a skeleton structure. The third one we're looking at is to do with gearing. There's two different things within gearing, but it's generally worth the same marks as profitability and liquidity. So gearing, what we're looking at here for gearing is our formula, which is our gearing formula I'll show you here. Gearing ratio and interest cover, they're the two I have down in the formula section. So my gearing ratio is my debt capital, which is loans plus debentures plus preference shares. Again, my loans or debentures are found here. Preference shares 250 plus 250. So it's my loans plus debentures plus preference shares is my debt capital. My total capital is my capital employed. Capital employed is obviously easy to follow. It's the balancing figures at the bottom of the balance sheet. So the debt capital over total capital multiplied by 100 over 1 is equal to percent. Let's just say in this case my gearing rate is 60%. ABC are highly geared. You're highly geared if you're 50% and above, or you're lowly geared if you're below 50%. So in this case, we're 60%, which means ABC are highly geared. And you just leave it at that. If our answer was 40%, our gearing rate is 40%, I would say ABC are lowly geared. And if you want, you can say because they're below 40%. Last year, okay, so again, same as last two we've talked about already. Last year it was so on so forth percent. What was it for Shannon PLC? Our gearing for last year was 56%. So they gave it here as 56%. So last year it was 56%. We're going up to 60% here. So last year was 56%. The gearing has improved or disimproved compared to last year. Well, in this case, for gearing, you want the percent to be lower. You want your debt capital to be a lower percent of your total capital. You don't want your loan to be huge, and you end up owing more money, more or less owing 80% of your total worth of the business. If 80% of your business that you own was funded through a loan, that means that you owe a lot of that money back, and it means you're kind of struggling. It would mean you are highly geared. Most of your business is financed by a loan, which would be a bad thing because you eventually have to pay a lot of money back. So we're 60% this year. We were 56% last year. We're still highly geared. Both last year and this year were above 50%. But last year it was 56%. The gearing has disimproved compared to last year. Why has it disimproved compared to last year? Because the gearing has gone up again. It's gotten higher. And if my gearing rate gets higher, it's a bad thing. The gearing for next year is predicted to be X%. The only time I'll talk about this is if they give me next year's figures here instead of last year's figures. Generally that won't happen, so I'm keeping it here, but in general you won't need it. You're going to talk about one or the other. So this case my gearing 60%, last year was 56%. It's gone up, which is a bad thing. It's disimproved. This is an unhealthy trend because it's disimproved. It indicates that the company is or is not dependent on outside borrowing. So if my company is highly geared, I am kind of very dependent on outside borrowing. If I was 70-80% highly geared, it would be very bad, and I'd be really dependent on outside borrowing. If you were to just think about it, my capital employed, about how we financed our company, if most of this 1,087,000 came from a loan and preference shares, which I kind of have to pay back, that would be a lot of money that I have to owe back in the future, and that would be a bad thing. So the higher geared companies are very dependent on outside borrowing, and if we're a lowly geared company, if we're below 50%, we are not. The company is not dependent on outside borrowing. Depending on what your answer is here is depending on what you'll fill in there. The second part of the gearing we're looking at is interest cover. Again, that formula is given just in our gearing section here. Net profit before interest over interest. So I'll fill that out depending on the information they give me in the question, and I'll get my answer. I'm going to say it's 4 times. So my answer is 4 times. So interest cover for this year is let's say 4.2. We'll just say 4.2 just to fill it in. 4.2 times. Last year it was, and then I go back to my question from last year, and I find that the interest cover last year was 4.3 times. So my interest cover for last year was 4.3 times, and this year my interest cover is, I'm just going to change this to 6 times just so that they're different. So 6 times this year, last year was 4.3 times. So what has happened? My interest cover has gone up. So my net profit before interest over interest is now higher. I want my interest cover to be as high as possible because that means that I'm able to cover my interest more and more times with the amount of profit I have. If my profit is 100,000, my profit before interest, my interest was 10,000, I'd be able to cover my interest 10 times, which is a good thing. So in this case, my interest for this year is 6 times, and last year was 4.3 times. My interest has improved compared to last year. The interest cover for next year is predicted to be x times. Again, only if they give you the information for budgeted, projected figures for next year will you discuss this. And you'll do that in place of last year's figures. Mostly you won't need to write about it. There's not much else to write on interest cover. We're just going to say the company is or is not able to cover their interest charges, and we're only depending that upon what their amount is. So the company is able to cover their interest charges as their interest cover is above the minimum acceptable amount of at least 2 times. So providing that your interest cover this year is above 2 times, you're going to say the company is able to cover their interest charge as they're above the minimum accepted amount of at least 2 times. And for vast majority of questions, you'll find that they are above 2 times. Very, very rare company wouldn't have enough profit to cover their interest at least 2 times. That would be a very bad sign. So that is a skeleton notes done out. I'm obviously going to get you to write this down into your copy. This can be used to more or less kind of get half of the marks in every single question every single year. Obviously it's only half of the marks, so we have a lot more work to go because now we need to start tailoring our answer towards the specific questions. You've listened to, this is a long video, and you've listened to this at least once, and I'm guessing for a lot of this you felt a little bit confused. I tried to talk slowly, but I'm not really basing this off any specific question. But you're going to need to take this down, and you're going to need to probably watch this video a couple of times, probably at least twice, just to kind of understand and pause and rewind and see what I'm talking about in certain sections. And I'll discuss with you where to go from here.